Something strange happens before your life changes, not after. Before, people become distant. Your old routines stop feeling right. Things that once excited you suddenly feel empty. And for a while, it almost feels like life is falling apart instead of coming together. But what if that phase isn't punishment? What if it's preparation? Because Daniel Kahneman understood something most people never notice. Human beings are terrible at recognizing transformation while it's happening. We only understand the pattern after we survive it. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand why confusion, isolation, emotional exhaustion, and uncertainty often appear right before your winning era begins. Not randomly, psychologically. And here's the warning. Once you understand this, you'll stop interpreting difficult seasons the same way. There's always that one period in life people never talk about honestly. The in-between phase, not where you used to be, not yet where you're going, just suspended. And emotionally, that phase can feel brutal because nothing feels stable anymore. Your mind changes first, then your relationships, then your priorities. And eventually, your entire identity starts shifting quietly underneath you. But here's what most people miss. Winning eras rarely begin with confidence. They begin with awareness, painful awareness, the awareness that your current life no longer fits who you're becoming. Now think about this carefully. Most people stay trapped because familiarity feels emotionally safer than transformation. Even unhappy familiarity. And this is exactly what Kahneman's work revealed repeatedly. The brain prefers certainty over possibility, even when certainty is making you miserable. That changes everything, because now you realize many people are not stuck because they lack potential. They're stuck because their nervous system became addicted to predictability. And this is where everything starts shifting internally. Before your life improves externally, your thinking usually becomes uncomfortable first. You start questioning things you once accepted automatically. Why am I chasing this? Why do I tolerate certain people? Why do I feel emotionally exhausted all the time? And suddenly, you begin noticing patterns that were invisible before. Now, here's where it gets deeper psychologically. Most people don't actually want growth. They want relief. There's a difference. Growth requires uncertainty. Relief requires escape. And emotionally reactive people spend most of their lives escaping discomfort instead of learning from it. But this is the part no one tells you. The people entering their winning era often become quieter first, not because they're weak, because they're observing, and observation changes people deeply. You begin noticing who drains your energy, who only appears when they need something, who supports your comfort but fears your growth. And once you see those things clearly, you can't unsee them. Now think about how lonely that realization can feel. Because awareness creates distance. Distance from unhealthy patterns. Distance from shallow conversations. Distance from people who benefited from the older version of you. And this is where everything changes emotionally. You stop forcing connection. You stop explaining yourself constantly. You stop chasing validation from emotionally unavailable people. And at first, that silence feels uncomfortable. But later, it becomes peace. Now here's where Daniel Kahneman's psychology becomes extremely important. He understood that human beings suffer heavily from cognitive distortion. The mind predicts disaster too quickly. Temporary confusion becomes, my life is failing. Loneliness becomes, I'm being left behind. Uncertainty becomes, I'll never figure this out. But what if those interpretations are incomplete? What if your brain is mistaking transition for destruction? Because this is what often happens right before transformation. Old emotional identities begin collapsing. And identity collapse feels terrifying at first. The version of you built around survival slowly stops functioning. People-pleasing stops feeling rewarding. Constant distraction stops working. Fake confidence becomes exhausting to maintain. And suddenly, you begin craving something deeper, something real. Now pay attention to this. Winning eras are rarely loud in the beginning. They start internally, with emotional clarity, with standards changing quietly, with your attention shifting away from chaos and toward alignment. And this is where people around you become confused, because externally you may look calmer, but internally everything is reorganizing. Now here's the strange part. Before life improves significantly, many people go through emotional isolation first. Not because life is punishing them, because solitude forces self-awareness. And self-awareness changes decisions. You begin seeing how much of your life was built on fear. Fear of rejection, fear of disappointing people, fear of being misunderstood. And once you see those fears clearly, they stop controlling you automatically. Now, let's go deeper. Most people believe winning eras begin when opportunities arrive. That's not true. They begin when your internal standards change. Because once your standards change, your behavior changes naturally. You stop entertaining certain conversations. Stop tolerating emotional inconsistency. Stop abandoning your own needs just to keep temporary peace. And this is where everything shifts psychologically. Your energy becomes intentional instead of reactive. Now, think about this carefully. Emotionally exhausted people struggle to create meaningful lives because survival mode narrows perception. When the nervous system is overwhelmed, the brain focuses only on immediate relief, not long-term growth. And this is why emotional healing matters more than most people understand, because clarity cannot fully exist inside constant emotional chaos. And this is the part no one tells you. Before your winning era begins, you usually lose interest in proving yourself to everyone. Not because ambition disappears, because desperation disappears. And that changes everything. Now you're no longer chasing attention emotionally. You're building stability internally. And internal stability creates external power over time, slowly, quietly, but permanently. And this is where the deeper transformation begins. You stop asking, how do I impress people? And start asking, how do I become aligned with myself? That question changes lives, because now your decisions come from awareness, not emotional survival. And this is where everything starts opening up. And this is where people usually misunderstand transformation completely. They think their winning era begins when life finally becomes easy. But often it begins the moment they stop emotionally collapsing every time life becomes difficult. That's the real shift. Emotional stability, because emotionally unstable people destroy opportunities they prayed for. Not intentionally. Subconsciously, they overreact, overthink, self-sabotage, seek reassurance constantly, and eventually their fear becomes stronger than their potential. But this is where everything changes. The people entering their winning era slowly become harder to emotionally manipulate. Not colder, clearer. Now think about how powerful that is. Someone ignores them, they don't immediately panic. Someone misunderstands them, they don't destroy themselves trying to explain endlessly. Someone leaves, they grieve it, but they don't abandon themselves anymore. And this emotional shift changes everything externally, because emotionally grounded people make better long-term decisions. Daniel Kahneman understood this deeply. Human beings are heavily influenced by temporary emotions. Fear changes judgment. Stress changes perception. Anxiety changes decision-making. And most people never realize how much of their life was built during emotional confusion. Now here's the difficult truth. Before your winning era begins, your old emotional patterns usually become impossible to ignore. You notice how often you betray your intuition, how often you stay silent to avoid conflict, how often you seek validation from people who barely validate themselves. And eventually, you get tired, not physically, mentally, spiritually, and this exhaustion becomes important because exhaustion creates honesty. You stop pretending certain things don't hurt. Stop pretending certain relationships don't drain you. Stop pretending you're okay living disconnected from yourself. And this is where everything changes internally. The mask starts breaking. Now, pay attention to this carefully. Many people think their life is falling apart when their false identity is simply falling away. That's different, very different, because the version of you built around fear cannot enter your next chapter successfully. It would sabotage it. And this is why transformation feels uncomfortable. Your mind is trying to leave an old identity while your nervous system still wants familiarity. That internal conflict creates confusion, but confusion is not always failure. Sometimes confusion is evidence of expansion. Now here's what most people miss. Winning eras often begin with separation. Separation from distractions, from emotionally chaotic people, from environments that reward survival instead of growth. And yes, that separation can feel lonely at first, because growth changes your emotional language. Things that once entertained you no longer satisfy you deeply. You crave peace more than stimulation, depth more than popularity, honesty more than attention. And this is where people around you begin noticing the shift. You react less, explain less, chase less. And strangely, that quiet confidence changes how life responds to you. Because emotionally centered people create emotional safety, and emotional safety attracts opportunities. Relationships improve, decision-making improves, focus improves, not instantly, gradually. Now here's where it becomes deeper psychologically. Kahneman explained that humans are naturally loss-averse, meaning we fear losing something more than we value gaining something better. That's why people stay in painful situations for years. The familiar pain feels safer than uncertain growth. But people entering their winning era eventually reach a breaking point. A moment where staying the same becomes more painful than changing. And that moment changes everything. Now growth finally becomes emotionally necessary, not optional. And this is where real transformation starts happening quietly. You begin protecting your attention differently because attention shapes identity. What you focus on repeatedly becomes your emotional reality. If you constantly focus on fear, your life starts shrinking psychologically. If you constantly focus on chaos, your nervous system adapts to instability. But when your attention becomes intentional, your life slowly reorganizes around clarity. And this is why awareness matters so much. Awareness interrupts automatic living. Now you're not just reacting unconsciously anymore. You're observing yourself in real time. That changes behavior. And changed behavior changes outcomes. Now here's the strange part. Before your winning era fully arrives, you may feel emotionally disconnected from your old life. The conversations feel repetitive. The habits feel empty. The old goals no longer excite you emotionally. And this can feel terrifying because humans crave certainty. But this is the part no one tells you. The old version of you must emotionally expire before the new version can fully emerge. And that process feels uncomfortable because identity is emotional. You're not just changing habits, you're changing who you believe yourself to be. And once that identity shifts, everything else follows naturally. Now let's bring this to the final truth. Your winning era is not just about success externally. It's about internal congruence, becoming emotionally aligned with your own values, no longer performing constantly for approval, no longer abandoning yourself to maintain connection, no longer shrinking your truth just to stay emotionally accepted. That's freedom, and freedom changes everything. Now think about your own life. Maybe the exhaustion you feel right now isn't random. Maybe the distance, the confusion, the emotional shifts are not signs you're losing your way. Maybe they're signs your mind is preparing for a different life entirely, a calmer life, a clearer life, a more intentional life, and this is where everything becomes clear. Winning eras don't begin when life suddenly becomes perfect. They begin when you stop emotionally betraying yourself. That's the real beginning. Quietly, internally, one honest decision at a time.